It's Monday, August 14th, 2023. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with the inaugural Documenting Congress Oral History Project interview sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm here today on the campus of Shepherd University in beautiful Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Joining me is Dr. Ray Smock. He is the interim director of the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education here at Shepherd University. He also served as historian of the U.S. House of Representatives from 1983 until 1995. A graduate of Roosevelt University in Chicago, he earned his PhD in history from the University of Maryland at College Park, where he was co-editor, along with Lewis Harland, of the 14-volume Booker T. Washington Papers. Dr. Smock is also the author of 2009's Booker T. Washington, Black Leadership in the Age of Jim Crow. He has co-authored, edited, and contributed to a number of other works, including Congress Investigates, A Critical History with Documents, and Masters of the House, Congressional Leadership Over 2 Centuries. Dr. Smock has served on the West Virginia Humanities Council, as well as the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, and served stints as president of the Association for Documentary Editing, the Society for History in the Federal Government, and the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress. Dr. Smock, Ray, thank you so much for inviting me here to campus, to West Virginia. It's my first time in West Virginia in almost 2 decades, so it is just as beautiful as I remember. The roads are a little windier than I remember, but it is good to be here and good to be with you. Likewise.
Glad to have you here.
So let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your childhood and upbringing.
Well, I was born in 1941, in February of 41, before the U.S. got into the war, and my mother died in 42, and my dad got drafted in 44. So I was basically raised by my dad's mother, my grandmother. We lived in an industrial suburb of Chicago called Harvey, Illinois, convergence of 3 railroads and lots of factories. The little house that we lived in, when I looked out my bedroom window, I looked right into a foundry furnace. So I watched sparks fly all night, men working, and I went to sleep to the sounds of that industrial world, and I kind of liked it. It was my world, and I had no problems with it. In Harvey was an interesting community at that time. Had good schools, had a good high school that was about 3 blocks from the little house we lived in. And even in grade school, I was interested in editing, of all things. My first editing experience was the grade school I went to was called the Bryant School, named for William Cullen Bryant. And I edited a news magazine called The Bryantette. And basically I cribbed information from encyclopedias that my fellow classmates weren't reading. So I would tell them, did you know how many tons of debris blew up when the Krakatoa volcano blew up in such and such a year? And they would be amazed by these facts. So I guess I started out early as an editor, but I really wanted to be a scientist. And astronomy was a huge thing to me as a kid.
Sure.
And first time I looked at Saturn through a telescope, it was an epiphany. And so I started spending my time at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. I'd get on the subway, the Illinois Central as we called it then, and in 40 minutes I would be at the Adler Planetarium in downtown Chicago. Spent a lot of time there as a kid. Then went to a junior college, which was connected to our high school, Thornton Township High School, and didn't really have any plans to go to college. No one in my family had ever been to college. My dad was a civil engineer, but it was basically through correspondence courses and things. In those days, you could get your license without actually attending a college. So my dad was largely absentee when he didn't come back from the war until 46, and then went to work for the U.S. Aeronautical Administration. He was a surveyor that was laying out runways for the expanding civil aviation that was occurring right after the war. And so he would go off in all kinds of different places around the country, sometimes sitting for weeks in a hotel waiting for a clear sky so he could shoot shoot the North Star. So for laying out runways, he laid out O'Hare Airport and a number of others as they expanded. O'Hare Airport was there.
Sure, sure.
But
a little bit smaller than it is now.
Yes, indeed. So he was largely absentee in my early life.
And you continued living with your grandparents?
With my grandmother, who was a cook at a big granary not far from where we lived. She never drove a car, so she would be picked up at 6 o'clock in the morning, 2 blocks from the house, and she would leave some warm oatmeal, and I'd get up and go to school by myself. And it was this may sound like hardship, but I didn't think so.
You sound very independent.
I
sounds
think,
like
yeah, it was, and I was the only child, so I was the center of her universe, and Dad sent some money back from time to time. The house we lived in was not the greatest place in the world. It was built in the 1920s, and really sort of basically 2 small bedrooms on the second floor, 1 bathroom on the second floor, a kitchen, a living room, and a dining room on the first floor, and a pretty tiny house. But it was a great place to grow up. I had my own bedroom. I had my own chemistry set, and I could pretty much just be my own self. By the time I did go to college, I was also at that time. We're talking 1950, 58, 59. I graduated from high school in 58, and was taking courses, and also working in a factory. I was a printer slotter operator at Container Corporation, printing boxes that held things like Del Monte canned corn or Grain Belt beer. These were all customers, and I'd set up the press, and we'd run off 10, 15,000 boxes at a stretch. And so that was my job. And by then I had my own car, and so I was driving to work and taking courses. And I took, thinking I was going to eventually become a scientist.
Right.
I took a lot of math, and I found that I wasn't very good at it. I flunked college algebra 2, maybe 3 times, I can't remember, because I was coming off the night shift and I was sitting in class and falling asleep, and it just wasn't working out.
Hard to solve for X when you can't stay awake.
So eventually, though, I ran across a professor, a teacher at Thornton Junior College by the name of Dale Chapman. He was the first mentor in history that I had, and I was lucky to have 3 of them in my career. Dale Chapman was the first. He taught history, he taught American history, British history. It's a junior college, he taught everything.
That's right.
And he didn't use textbooks, he used documents. So this was my introduction to documents. The book we used was Commanger's Documents of American History. And it was fascinating because he expected us to read the documents, try to put context to them, but then as a professor, he would provide the stories that went with the documents, and it was good education. And so
more folks could take a leaf out of his book. That's my commentary.
Yeah. Well, it turned out that put me on a history path.
Yeah.
I always liked writing, and I always liked to read a lot. And of course, history is a reading and writing discipline, if there ever was
Amen.
one. So that led me to want to pursue a regular university somewhere. But my grades weren't good enough, and we didn't have any money to put me in a college anywhere. and no one really thought it was a priority except me. So in order to get into Roosevelt University in Chicago, I passed Roosevelt University when I would take my trips to the city, and it was this big building right on Michigan Avenue, and it seemed like a real bustling, interesting place. I didn't know much about it, but it was a place I knew, and so I applied. And at that time, of course, Sputnik had gone off just a few years before, and the government created the National Defense Education Act, which put an awful lot of people in colleges that never would have gone, and I'm one of them. But my grades weren't good enough, so I had to go back to the junior college, and in one semester I took 19 credit hours and got 19 hours of A. That included 1 credit hour of gym, and that was enough for me to qualify for an NDA loan. So it wasn't that much money. I think in 2 years at Roosevelt University, and it was maybe $2,500 or $3,000 at the time, but that seemed like a lot of money, and it seemed like a lot of debt. But compared to what debt goes today, so at Roosevelt University, I entered there in '64, and of course the summer of ¡64 was the great civil rights activities in the South. I was going to a university that opened my eyes to racial diversity, because Roosevelt University had an awful lot of black students and students of various ethnic groups, and it was a very universal place. Very exciting for me, because I, didn't know much about that world. But when the 3 civil rights workers, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, were murdered in the summer of '64, it actually changed my life. And the convergence of me going to Roosevelt University, and I became an activist in the civil rights movement. And the first sign that I carried in a protest or in a demonstration was just a sign that said those 3 names: Goodman, Schwerner, Cheney. And my curiosity about African American experience, I knew nothing of it. I had no contact. So my curiosity is what drove me into African American studies. And by the merest of coincidence, the first year I was at Roosevelt University, one of the leading scholars of African American studies, August Meyer, arrived there, and it was just an incredible experience taking his courses. Tremendously demanding, didn't suffer fools gladly, was hard on his students, and I loved every minute of it. And if he told us to read 10 books, I'd go out and read 10 books. And of course he did. I mean, he was just, he came in with a big stack of books. And so I was lucky to work under him. He was, at the time, following Martin Luther King around, and he wrote a seminal article on Martin Luther King that is still standard on that subject. He was debating Malcolm X, and it was a whole world that opened up into to me there. So, and then when I left Roosevelt University in '66, by then I was going to do graduate work, and my grades were good enough, and I was ready to go on to graduate school. And I ended up settling on the University of Maryland, because when I came to College Park, and of course I came through, visited D.C.
Sure.
My first visit in April of '66 to Washington, D.C. was another one of those epiphanies.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. Of course I knew about the town, but there I was in it, saw the Capitol, got Potomac fever even though I didn't know I had the disease yet, and attended Roosevelt University. And the year that I entered there, Lewis Harlan was coming from the University of Cincinnati. He was a good friend with Augie Meyer from Roosevelt, and Augie said to me, when you get to Maryland, look up my friend Lewis Harlan. I walked into his office the first day of registration, and I said, Professor Harlan August Myers says to tell you hello. And he says, oh, you know Augie. Oh, good. He said, and you're interested in African American history? I said, yes, of course I am. And then his next words were, do you play tennis? And I said, yeah, I play tennis. He said, well, let's play tennis tomorrow. This started the beginning of a collaboration that lasted until Lewis passed in 2010.
That is old school networking right there.
It was wonderful. It was absolutely amazing. And then he was working on a biography of Booker T. Washington at the time, which later won the Pulitzer Prize. And also planning the Booker T. Washington papers, an edition of those. And that was the first African American who was going to get the kind of multi-volume treatment that the Founding Fathers got. And of course, again, we're talking the 60s, and all of a sudden everybody's getting aware of civil rights, and you had all these documentary projects on George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all these wonderful slave-holding white guys, and no African Americans. And so Booker T. Washington was the first of which eventually many other African American leaders were treated the same way, Du Bois and others. But at that time, this was the first serious multi-volume study of an African American. And that became my dissertation, as well as the work on the project. And I stayed with Lewis. We started that project in '67, and I stayed with him until 1982.
Oh, wow.
So, during that time, we completed the project, 14 volumes of papers. The Booker T. Washington papers were at the Library of Congress.
Okay.
And other places. We traveled to, I don't know, 30 or 40 repositories.
That answers that question, because I wasn't sure how that process worked, because they were so diffuse.
Yeah, and of course Tuskegee Institute in Alabama had a big collection, and then scattered letters in all kinds of places, at Harvard, Yale, and there's some of their collections. But the bulk of them at the Library of Congress. So it took us almost 9 years to read the collection, and it's over 1 million items. And from that, we selected about 160,000 as research documents that we wanted to sort of copy and create a research file. And out of that large research file, in 14 volumes, we published just 6,000 documents in those 14 volumes. But those others were enriched, the footnotes and all the background research. So it was a huge thing that we winnowed down to 14 volumes. 13 really. The 14th volume was an index. That was an amazing time to be working in the field, and of course I got to know everybody in the field, and most of them, a lot of the top scholars in African American studies were on our board of directors. You know, John Hope Franklin, C. Van Woodward, a lot of folks that.
And this coincided with the absolute explosion of historian, the John Blassingame, and
John Blassingame was on our project.
I mean, there's just so many names that many of whom C. Van Woodward worked with and Lewis Harlan worked with, and that was just an absolutely boom time for the field, which is sad. You know, when we think of the field of the state of the field in history, the discipline right now, it's a little. We can look back in the salad days of PhD production.
Well, yeah, it's true, because at the University of Maryland, we ended up the department expanded. We had 300 full-time graduate students at the University of Maryland, in all fields, not just in African American studies, but African American studies was. There was a handful of us in that field too, including Pete Daniel. And Pete, of course, went on to be a leading scholar and leader of professional organizations, and then became a curator at the Smithsonian for many years. And Pete and I were good, close friends, and we we met working on the Booker T. Washington project in those days.
And your path crossed with somebody who's very important to my life and career, Jim Cobb, who came. I believe his first teaching gig was at University of Maryland.
I was Jim Cobb's TA in those days.
That's something we have in common.
Yep, yeah. There you go. Several generations apart.
Separated by just a few. I believe I was his TA in 2010 was my first TA gig with Dr. Cobb.
He was there in the 70s, so it's about 50 years difference.
Yeah. He probably had more hair, but he was just as mean, I'm sure.
He was great. He's still a good friend, and I love him dearly. So it was. What we would do is in those days, go to the Library of Congress. I'd drive down to the city. I'd go up in front of the Capitol, on the east front of the Capitol, right across from the Library of Congress. And I'd say to the cop who was on duty, and it was a cop then, he had a little pistol on his side, no armor, no assault rifles or anything like that. And I'd say, I'm going to be researching at the Library of Congress. Can I park here? And most of the time, yes. Every once in a while, he'd say, "Get out of here, kid." He says, "The president's coming up here today. Go park someplace else." And so I'd park right there on the east front of the Capitol, go walk across to the main Library of Congress, and we had a stack up in the decks where we could keep a lot of research books and things like that. It was a wonderful time to be on the Hill in that capacity. And of course, all the scholars and researchers that come through there, you get to know many of them. One day I was sitting in the library reading room, and there was this guy. He looked kind of out of place, and he was wearing a plaid shirt, and he wasn't even. I think he was wearing some tennis shoes or something, and didn't look like a real researcher for some reason. And so I said to the librarian at the reading library desk, and I said, "Who is that guy over there? That old coot over there," I think I said. The guy looked at me and says, "That's John Dos Passos."
Oh my God.
And of course I'd read all of John Dos Passos. My God. So I was embarrassed. So I went over to and introduced myself to him. And he said, "You want to have lunch?" So I became, one of the side benefits of researching at the Library of Congress is you meet all these different interesting people. And so I became friends with one of my authors that I admired the most.
Wow.
And we would frequently have lunch when I'd see him in the reading room. So it was a good experience. So then I did my PhD work was in the Booker T. Washington project.
Right.
Editing several volumes of the papers on my own without, way ahead of where everybody else was working on the project, so it would be independent. And that took a while to get the university to approve that, because they said, okay, you can do this, and it's an important job, important scholarship and all that, but you'll never amount to anything unless you write a monograph. So
sounds very familiar. Some things don't change, right?
Yeah, some things don't change. Well, I eventually did write a monograph, but that was a lot of years later. And about the time we were finishing the Booker T. Washington project, I got wind of a job. It was actually advertised in the New York Times, Washington Post, a number of other places, several journals, New Republic, places like that. They were advertising for a historian at the U.S. House of Representatives, and so that was intriguing. The House had never had a historian before, nor had the House ever done a national search for a position. Usually, if you go to work for Congress, of course you're elected, and then the people that the elected officials, you go to work for them. The House hires its own staff, and usually that's inside baseball because
yeah.
everybody, you're moving up the ladder. You're already in the clerk's office. You get a chance to move up in different positions. The idea that they wanted a historian that was not a crony of any member of Congress or that was somebody's favorite buddy. And so they did a national advertising and did a national search. And I applied for that job along with about 120 other people.
Right.
And lo and behold, I was one of 17 finalists.
17 finalists.
Out of this was crazy because I don't know if the House had never done this before, and they didn't know exactly what they were doing. But they wanted to bring the 17 finalists to the Capitol for a reception. All of us had
All of you at the same time?
All of us in the same place. In the same room, in the speakers' rooms, we had the speaker had a reception for the 17 finalists. And when I walked into the room, I was amazed that I knew almost all of them. And I went around shaking everybody's hand. Oh my goodness, to see you! I'm glad you're
just like
a
a conference.
It was like being at a history conference. It was phenomenal. Well, of course, what none of us knew at the time was that the parliamentarian staff and other people there were sort of giving us the once-over. They were seeing how we all reacted. They were getting a feel for us and how so it was part of our entrance exam without even knowing it. So then those 17 were whittled down to 3 finalists, and then the speaker made the decision from the recommendation of
This would have been Tip O'Neill.
This was Tip O'Neill at the time, yes. And I got the job. I still don't know exactly how or why. I think, I had a lot of experience as a researcher in the Library of Congress.
Right.
Years of that. And I was very interested in politics and apparently knew enough of, I did a lot of research before I got my first interview about the House. I wasn't a scholar of Congress.
Right. Not many people were at that time.
Well, nobody, and they still aren't. We still don't have enough scholars of Congress. Everybody wants to be a presidential historian,
right?
And write a book about a president and become famous. And how do you deal with the House of Representatives? You got a couple of leaders in both bodies, but basically you got 435 House members. You got a complex committee system. You got 100 senators, or who are co-equal. And so where do you find the core? It's easier to say, oh, this is a presidential administration, and this is the president, and you can focus on that. And of course, you've got all these presidential libraries. Do you know of any congressional libraries? No, there are congressional centers now, and of course, I've been involved in that. We're sitting in one of them.
That's right, that's right, that's
today.
right.
So not quite the kind of money or prestige of the complex presidential library system, which deals with presidential administration.
So, which, obviously things have changed since 1983, and you've been at the forefront of that. And Dick Baker and Don Ritchie and other folks we'll be talking to for this project. But what was it like in 1983, 1984, trying to wrap your head around, I mean, because there's Neil McNeil's book, that was out there, but how did you walk into the office and say, what now? Or was there a charge? What was that like?
One of of course, we were the reason that the House decided to hire a historian was because they were beginning to plan for the 200th anniversary of not only Congress but the Constitution, all 3 branches of the government. And the Senate had created a history office in 1976, and it was functioning and doing good work on the Senate side under the tutelage of Dick Baker and Don Ritchie, both of whom stayed there almost 40 years.
Right.
And of course, Don was a friend of mine in graduate school at the University of Maryland, as was Dick Baker. I don't know if they had any effect on the outcome in the House side. Usually the House and the Senate don't talk to one another. So, but they may have put in a good word for me. I don't know.
Well, why do you think the House sort of dithered while the Senate had a office of Senate historian for almost a decade or more. By the time you were there.
Well, it was 7 years.
Seven.
Yeah, they had a 7-year head start on us. I'm not sure about that. Even at the time that I was appointed, it was all set in 1982 that the resolution would come up and it would be passed by unanimous consent. And then some Republicans jumped up and objected to this unanimous consent, so that postponed it. This was all oiled by the Speaker and everything like that, but a few of the Republicans decided they were against it. And so it was postponed until '83 when the vote came up again. By this time, some of the objections had been smoothed over, and a historian, a PhD, who was in the House by the name of Newt Gingrich. This is 1983. This is many years. It's a long time, more than a decade before he would become a leader. Newt Gingrich stood up and said that it was important that we have a history office, and it's not going to cost very much money, and it will do a lot of good work. And so he basically led the charge to have the bill come up again, and it passed. So then they did the national search, as I mentioned, and then I was appointed in late '83. In the meantime, what I had done was research on things that the House ought to be doing that they weren't doing with their history. And one of those, of course, would be to redo and update the Biographical Directory of Congress, a very, very valuable publication that was started about the time of the Civil War, and it was done every 5 or 10 years. And then in modern times, oh no, this is expensive, we don't need it, that kind of talk. And so they hadn't done it for almost 20 years.
Oh my goodness.
And I said, well, we're going to update that. And also, again, this is the 80s, computers, and I promised that we would put that into an electronic form so that we could update it easily forever in the future. And so that was one of the arguments that I made. And I was interviewed by a number of members who were on the search committee, and I laid out these plans. So apparently that was what they were interested in. I don't know. Other than that, I don't know how I ended up getting it, and nobody else did. So I was grateful, and I loved every minute of my 12 years on the Hill. It was every day was different. Every day was a challenge. You got to know members of Congress not as cardboard figures in newspapers, and you saw them as three-dimensional human beings, and some of them were great, and some of them were not so great. But that's the humanity of it.
Right.
And my office was nonpartisan. It was an equal number of Republicans and Democrats who were on the committee, and one of the few committees that had an equal number.
Right.
So they tried to make it as nonpartisan as possible, and that's the way it was.
Who did you report to?
My office was directly in the Speaker's office.
Really? Okay.
The Rule 1 of the House of Representatives had a new clause to it that just added, that in addition to all the duties of the Speaker, the administration of the office of his House historian.
Okay.
So I reported directly to the Speaker, and I testified for my own budget every year, along with all the other officers, the clerk and the sergeant at arms and the doorkeeper and all these other offices that had big budgets, and I'd come in and ask for a couple $100,000.
Which is nothing in congressional terms.
Well, But it was fun. You know, the subcommittee on House appropriations. It was they would go through the routine every year when I do my budget, but they actually almost spent more time with me than they did with the officers. All that was done. They had hundreds of millions of dollars of budget and all that sort of thing, but they want to ask the historians a few questions. So it was fun. I ended up being both the Republicans and the Democrats on the committee were interested in history and what we were doing.
Right.
So and we did a number of publications, and we planned major events, both in D.C. and in Washington, in New York City and other places for the bicentennial.
Right.
I had no idea when I got the job that I would be involved in major productions. Of events. You have at one point when we took the Statue of Freedom off the top of the Capitol, brought it down to earth so that it could be restored. This was in 1993.
Oh, wow.
Then we had a big event to put it back up after it was restored, and 60,000 people show up, and the President of the United States is there, and others, and I'm writing all the speeches. I didn't write Bill Clinton's speech, but I talked to his speechwriter so that he wouldn't be repeating what the other people were saying.
Right.
And so you do a lot of things behind the scenes that no one knows what's going on, and a lot of the members would like to give historical minutes. They get up and give these short little talks before they get down to business every day, and so a lot of them would ask me to write little history vignettes that usually had to do something in their own state, their own district. And so I did a lot of those, and they were fun. They're hard to do. It's hard to write a history story in a minute. You had to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's only a minute talk.
We historians are not known necessarily for our
brevity,
our pithy, brevity. Right. So
you want to stretch the story out.
Yeah.
So you had to. So it was actually fun, and it was good training.
Yeah.
To be able to do that, and I actually enjoyed that. That was not in my job description.
No, well, that isn't that always the way.
Yeah. I don't know what my job description was when you come right down to it. And of course, we worked closely with the Senate Historical Office, and both the House and the Senate had bicentennial committees. Mm-hmm. And Senator Byrd, I got to know Senator Byrd because he was chairman of the Senate Bicentenary Commission.
Sure.
And on the House side, it was Congresswoman Lindy Boggs, a dear person who took me under her wing, and she was my mentor in the House of Representatives, and I couldn't have had a better mentor than Lindy. And her family took me under their wing. Of course, Lindy's daughter, Cokie Roberts, the journalist, ABC journalist, and one of Cokie's last public appearances before she passed was right here at the Byrd Center. She came out and helped us raise some money. So the whole Boggs family and took me under their wing, and it was one of the joys of my tenure there. And so, where do you want to go next?
Well, you talked about the biographical directory, and for somebody like me, who grew up and went to college and grad school in the days of the internet, we just take this for granted that you need to know who the congressman from the 5th Congressional District of Georgia was from 1945 to 1950. You can just go and look it up, and you can say, well, where's Robert Ramspeck's papers? Where's Judge Davis's papers? And it's like, Ramspeck didn't have any papers. He's from that generation. Judge Davis's papers are at Emory. That wasn't always the way. Tell me about the effort on your part, the archivists in the House historian's office, to find that information and compile it.
Well, one of the bicentennial projects that we undertook was to do a survey, first time. Where are all these congressional papers? And what's the nature of them? I mean, some of these collections, you'd find a folder in some repository somewhere. There'd be 5 letters in it.
Sure.
And other places, it would be voluminous records. But we worked, of course, when you're part of the Speaker's office, and when the Senate Historical Office is part of the leadership offices in the Senate, you have carte blanche to, basically call up anybody in government. And we worked very closely, of course, with the National Archives.
Right.
And so the National Archives staff was assigned the job of helping us conduct that survey. And we published that in a big book of where these collections were. And we found that at that time, more than 9,000 House members and maybe almost 1,600 or 1,700 senators had served. And we found 3,000 House collections, some of those very tiny, some of them major. What we learned is an awful lot of congressional history. It was just lost because nobody wanted it. And records would end up in a barn somewhere, and then the barn would burn down. We did find those collections, and that was important for us to have that as a basis. Both the House and the Senate published major catalogs of where these collections were. That was one of the bicentennial products. The biographical directory was another bicentennial product. And we did all smaller books on various topics like origins of the House of Representatives. One of the things that I discovered, and again, this is why you need a historian in these places. I was talking to the House Recording Studio, and of course they were covering the Congress. The Senate was reluctant at first, but the House had been doing C-SPAN broadcasts. So I said, what do you do with these videotapes when I first got there? Where are they stored? Oh, we don't store them for very long. We store them for 60 days and then recycle them. I said, why 60 days? Well, if there's any news value, usually we get requests for, maybe someone's speech on the floor or something like that. But after a while, nobody cares anymore. It's not news. So they were only thinking news,
right,
not history.
Right.
And so I said, this is incredibly valuable, and it should be preserved as part of our national documentary heritage. And so I had to go to the speaker for that. And then the question became, who's going to do this? And of course, C-SPAN would be happy to do it. And the Library of Congress said, "Oh no! This has got to be. The C-SPAN's a private organization. It's got to be the Congress that has this." And so they fought over that for a while, and they finally agreed, of course, that it should be preserved. And so they cut the baby in half, and so the Library of Congress does it, and so does C-SPAN. And so we went from no coverage to having 2 institutions that were recording and that were preserving the tape and saving the tapes that were recorded by the House recording studio.
Right.
For the longest time, C-SPAN always gets the feed from the House.
Right.
Or from the Senate once the Senate started doing and the Senate did it because they found out that the House was getting all this attention. And
Mr. Gingrich of Georgia was one of the pioneers of using C-SPAN.
Newt Gingrich used the coverage, the C-SPAN coverage, and to launch himself
special order speeches,
special orders where no one was on the floor, but yet it was being broadcast, and he developed a following. So we ended up having both of them recorded, and I think that's fine with me. That's good. C-SPAN eventually created a masterful archive of hundreds of thousands of hours, not only of the floor coverage, but of various other special programs that they did, and some committee hearings that they did. And the C-SPAN archive at Purdue University is an amazing facility. But again, these are the kinds of things that happened because there were historians, professional historians in the House and the Senate who were looking at the institution from a different angle
Right.
than anybody else was looking at it.
So at this time, you identify yourself as a historian, but you're doing a lot of work that, and I say this as somebody who is a historian working in archives. Did you also see yourself as an archivist, or were you a historian who collaborated closely with archivists? Or both?
Well, I considered myself a historian.
Sure.
But what I also became, though, was an administrator of an office in a very complex, very Byzantine place called the House of Representatives, with all of its committee chairmen, and everybody has its own fiefdoms. You have some staff members, top staff members on committees who are prima donnas and and gatekeepers and use their power, and others are just wide open. Let's get this job done, and they're very friendly. But
So
you have
it's
to deal
not
with all of them.
not unlike archives.
Well, it's archives the same difference. Of course, when I was while I was a historian, I served as a staff person who attended the National Historical Publications and Records Commission's meetings, which in those days the commission, it's still the case, they have members of the House and Senate, and they have actually Supreme Court justices served on the NHPRC, and top people from the State Department and others. So being on the commission in those days, first it was Lindy Boggs who was on the commission, and I represented her. She would come to the meetings from time to time, but basically I was there as her surrogate.
Sure.
And then later, Phil Sharp of Indiana became the member from the House, and I served as his surrogate. Phil said, if you'll be the surrogate, Ray, I'll do this, but otherwise I'm too busy. So that commission was doing excellent work in a lot of ways, and I was happy to be part of that. And of course, you get to know Supreme Court justices and have lunch with them, and so being where I was as part of the Speaker's office, receptions and events that you went to, I got to see an amazing cross section of the entire government. At the State Department events and State Department dinners and receptions at the Supreme Court, where you're sitting around with having a glass of wine with justices and talking all kinds of stuff. It really was, because I was in the Speaker's office,
Right.
I had an entree into government that I might not have had if I was someplace else
Right.
within the organizational structure.
Did it change when the speakers turned over? So you came in and Tip O'Neill was speaker, and then Jim Wright was speaker, and then who came after Jim Wright?
Tom Foley.
Tom Foley from Washington. So did the speakers sort of have their own imprimatur, or was this Ray Smock's office, let Ray run it kind of thing?
No, each of them, each of the speakers was different in the way they approached it. Tip O'Neill deferred to my expertise pretty much, although he wanted to know what was going on,
Sure.
and obviously
Sure.
I would visit with him or his top staff, and of course we were planning big events in Philadelphia during the bicentennial, and some of Tip O'Neill's staff would go with me when we worked on things in Philadelphia and New York City for these bicentennial events. And Jim Wright was actually the speaker when we did go to Philadelphia. We took a huge contingent of members, House and Senate members, on a special Amtrak train to sort of reenact some of the events where Congress met in Philadelphia.
Wow.
in the old chambers. And we had ceremonial events up there, and it was a wonderful, wonderful historical experience. But and one of the things that I wanted to do at the end of the ceremony that we had, where I'm writing a lot of the speeches, but some of the other members are doing their own thing. I wanted them to sing the preamble to the Constitution, which had been done as a theatrical production that we were in part helped develop. That went to Park Service sites all over the country. It was called Four Little Pages. It was a wonderful musical, a short musical with 4 actors, including Ben Franklin and a couple of other people. And so the preamble to and so Jim Wright said, "I don't know about that. Members of Congress singing." And I said, "Let me show you a video of how this thing works." I went into his office and put a VCR in his machine there, and he kind of liked it. And he said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "I'll tell you what. You have the musicians there, and if I see how things are going, I'll give you the nod, and you can bring them in." And so the event was going on. People were giving their speeches, and I think Jim thought it needed a finale. And he just went to me like that, just a nod. And I nodded to the guy at the door, and then he had a little script in case he decided to do this. He brought him in, and it turned out to be perfect. They hit the perfect note, and the members sang along the second verse, and it was really, really great to see the members actually getting excited about this and approaching the Constitution in a different way as music.
Yeah, yeah.
So, of course, later in Hamilton, everybody got
That's
Hamilton
right.
on the, but this was sort of a preamble to
Sure.
that many years earlier.
What about Speaker Foley?
Tom Foley was probably the most intellectual speaker that the House has ever had. You'd have to go all the way back to Thomas Brackett Reed in the 19th century
Oh, wow.
to find another that was interested in books, interested in ideas, who was a thoughtful, engaged guy, and he was great to work with. But Tom's chief of staff, very peculiar arrangement, was his wife, Heather Foley. And Heather Foley was a tough taskmaster who some say there's rumors that she had keys to every office and she would poke around the Capitol late at night. I don't know what for. But there's a million stories about Heather Foley, good and bad. I got along with her fine once, but it was tough establishing myself with her because she started out by intimidate you and browbeat you, and then see how you handled it. And if you stood up to the withering fire, well then she would relax and cooperate and make things happen. So it was never easy with her. I remember one time Lindy Boggs passed me in the Capitol, and she says, and she is a good Southern Louisiana lady, she says, "Darling, I understand you're having Heather problems." And she says, "You're not the only one. Stick in it, and you'll do just fine." So I think Foley delegated a lot of the internal stuff to his spouse, and that's tricky. I don't think it's a healthy situation. I didn't think so then, and but that was. But then when Foley lost his position, and of course in the election of '94, Newt Gingrich comes in as the heir apparent to become Speaker. Both Tom and Heather Foley were very kind and generous to helping those of us who were getting the axe to find other positions. Of course, in this case, it didn't work out. I actually applied to be archivist of the United States, and was one of the finalists. And I was interviewed at the White House on 2 occasions.
Wow.
But then President Clinton chose the former governor of Kansas, who lost his position and then tried to get a House seat, and then lost that position. But he was a good, loyal Democrat, and he had to have a position in Washington, so they named him archivist. But I don't know if I really had a chance at that position at all. So then, once I left the House, I never did. Newt would never talk to me about it. He was the one that fired me. But the House administration group, headed by Bill Thomas, Republican Bill Thomas at the time, basically, just a week before Christmas of 1994, I received a form letter that basically said my services would no longer be needed after January 2nd.
And that was the first.
We had inklings that we may be. There was lots of heads rolling, lots of staff changes.
Right, because this has been the first time.
First time in 40 years,
40 years
that the House became under Republican control, and we knew there'd be major changes.
Sure.
But it was sort of Armageddon for a lot of the Democratic staff people who some of them found places and others didn't. And of course, in my case, Newt was looking for a lot of people to fire, and he found out that he couldn't because he didn't have control over all these offices. He had control of the Speaker's office. The rules of the House prescribed his role. But all these other officers, they wanted to fire the parliamentarian, but then they realized that was a mistake because these people had 30, 40 years experience. And you got to run the Congress by the rules, and there's people who know those rules, and they're nonpartisan people. And I was nonpartisan as well, but Newt had a historian in mind that he wanted to bring in. So he basically politicized the office by firing me. And but anyhow, so not suddenly in early 1995, I'm out of work and basically went on my own as a consultant, as a historical consultant, researcher. I did a book for hire for Congressional Quarterly Press on landmark documents on the Congress. At the same time that there was the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia was being it was just still in the planning stages.
Right.
And I had been involved in that while I was a House historian. So I ended up getting later a consultantship as a historian on the site. Wrote the first draft. Was part of the team that wrote the first draft of all the exhibits at the National Constitution Center, and then part of the Constitution Center's main exhibit was a recreation of all the signers at the moment that the Constitution was signed on September 17th, 1787, and so my job was to help the sculptors decide what these people looked like. And of course, nobody had driver's license that had your height and weight and all that. You did it by portraits. I went to the National Portrait Gallery, did a lot of research. You did it by diary entries and by descriptions of people. And eventually, I was the first time that there was an effort to create these people, 39 signers plus 3 dissenters who were there that day but didn't sign.
That's right.
As life-size reproductions. And of course the Southern delegates, they dressed a little fancier. They had lace at their sleeves. and some of the New Englanders, they're pretty plain. No lace at your sleeves, are you kidding? And maybe the suit didn't even fit. But you were a good New Englander, and you were frugal, and you didn't necessarily buy a new suit every time you needed one. Whatever the case, I worked with the sculptors on all those statues, went to the factory, the Talix Art Factory, where they were being manufactured, and inspected every statue. In the course of that work, it turns out that I'm exactly the same size as Ben Franklin. And in case of Ben Franklin, there was a suit of his clothes that he wore at the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that's still preserved in the Smithsonian. It's never on display because it's too fragile.
Right.
It's a silk suit.
Yeah, can't do that.
I put on rubber gloves, and we measured it very carefully. The dye was coming off on the gloves. Very fragile suit. And even Ben Franklin's his breeches that came down to here, and then his stockings came up to his knees. You could see where his stomach is pushing over the suit. It still had the wrinkles in it. I said, I got pants hanging in my closet that look just like that.
I was getting ready to say that's something Ben and I have in common.
So, well, when we measured the suit and we measured my measurements, it turned out to be almost exact.
Wow.
Ben was actually an inch taller than I am, but the statue, the statue of him is seated, because he was 82 years old. Actually, I'm the same age as Ben was when he was at the Constitution now, but back then I was only in my 60s. So, but anyhow, he had to be seated because he was very sick at the time.
And it was
I had him pointing
swelteringly
at the Constitution and pointing it at George Washington. He's sort of sitting there like this. He's got his hand on a cane. So that's the position that I had to hold. First of all, they stripped me down to my underwear, covered me with Vaseline, and then I was put into plaster of Paris. In order to hold my hand up while all this was done, they took a 2x4 and stuck it up here so I could hold the pose. And then they put this gop over your head. Not that I look like Ben Franklin, but the dimensions of the body and the head are pretty close. So your head, they had to get a model of my head. And of course, you have one straw going up your nose, otherwise you're like in a diver bell.
No.
And some people can't deal with that.
So 38 other people had to do.
No. Well, no, they didn't do. Yeah, well, 38 other people had to do the same thing for their statues. Yes, that's right. And the statue of George Washington was done by a retired 52-year-old firefighter, New York firefighter, who had the same dimensions pretty much, and just a slight pot belly that George Washington had. And yeah, they were all real people that did all these statues.
And James Madison he wasn't even 5 foot tall.
James Madison, in one diary entry I saw on James Madison said, he's so small he's like a half a bar of soap. Well, he was,
you know exactly what that means.
He was 5'2", 5'3". Hamilton and Madison were the two shortest guys there.
Really, Hamilton? I did not.
Yeah.
Outsized personality, I guess.
Yeah, outsized personality, but Hamilton was a tiny guy.
It's more impressive that Aaron Burr could hit him then,
Yeah. But in any event, that was a great experience working on those statues and working on the Constitution Center, and that was one of my major contracts when when the Constitution Center opened in 2002. I had also been working here at I've been working with Senator Byrd since the late 90s on a center that he wanted to have built in West Virginia for his archive, and a West Virginia archive, other congressmen as well. And so I had these two interesting jobs: the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, and the Robert Byrd Center here that we were building from scratch and working with the architects and designing the place. And about the same time, in 2002, I was offered a vice presidency at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia and the directorship at the Byrd Center here in Shepherdstown. We're 75 miles from D.C. here in Shepherdstown, so it's close proximity. We had family still in the area, and in Baltimore and other places close by. and I was again I was in my early 60s, so I opted, instead of the big city and the big job in Philadelphia, I opted to take the Bird Center position, and I never regretted it. It's been fantastic to run this center. When you introduced me as the interim director.
That's right.
That's because I was here from 2002 to 2017 as the director, and then retired, and then came back during the COVID pandemic, and stayed. And I'm still here, but I will be leaving again at the end of the year after 3 years coming back as interim.
Right. Well, tell me why Shepherd University? Why did the senator decide on this campus?
The reason that he picked Shepherd University was because of its proximity to Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Originally, he'd sent some of his papers to WVU in Morgantown, which is the flagship campus of West Virginia, and the State University, big football team, all the other accoutrements, and as opposed to a small liberal arts school in the eastern panhandle, about 70 miles from Baltimore, 70 miles from D.C. So it's that proximity to the major research centers in D.C. that caused Bird to pick Shepherd.
Makes sense.
And so that's where he wanted it, and that's where it's built.
So I want to take a step back and sort of, take a look at some of the key events, milestones in our effort to document Congress and document the work of Congress. When did you become aware of or active in the Congressional Papers Roundtable of SAA? Were you ever a part of that, or was that left to the archivists?
No. The Congressional Papers Roundtable was something that we were very much a part of. I had an archivist that on my staff, Cynthia Pease Miller, and Cynthia took the lead, since she was the archivist for our office, with the paper roundtable. But I went to a number of their meetings, was totally involved in what they were working on and how they were putting things together. Cynthia eventually wrote the standard sort of text on how to preserve and acquire these papers and collections and so on.
So did you, right around this time, this is all happening right around the same time, 83, 84, 85, 86, our friend Frank McMahon at Dirksen and the NHPRC put together a conference not too far from here in Harper's Ferry in 1985, I believe. Were you at the Harper's Ferry conference?
I don't think so. I'm trying to think. I don't think I was.
So I think this was a meeting. It was one of those early meetings on accepting minimum standards for collections, repositories, that some of these separate.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at my own records to see if I was there at that time. I would have been in the House at that time, and certainly I started working with Frank McMahon early on because he was a leader in all this as the head of the Dirksen Center. Dirksen's the grandfather of all these various congressional centers that have developed.
Right. Well, in 1990, there's another milestone. It's the Advisory Committee on the Records of Congress. Were you part of the first crop?
Creator.
The creator.
Dick Baker and I basically wanted that institution developed.
Okay.
And yes, that was one of the things that we thought was very important, to bring all kinds of interested parties together to study the needs of the care and feeding of congressional records. And of course, it was well established at a high level with a lot of interesting people on it. And yes, we were part of that from the beginning, and basically was one of the things that we created during both Dick Baker's tenure and my tenure there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there, I think I was reading this in Cynthia's book. You know, she's got the the context behind all this, and during these years, there's all these conferences and symposia, and there was a big one at Margaret Chase Smith's library up in Maine.
Right.
I think it was Northwood University
I was
or something
there.
like that. So, what is bringing all these folks together at this time? Why this? Because it's after the bicentennial. Is this just an outgrowth of what you and
Yes,
Dick and Don are all?
This is exactly the kind of thing. Once both the House and the Senate get people who are interested in the history, broadly construed, and of course, obviously, it involves the records.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we worked with both the National Archives and a lot of other organizations to bring a synergy to all of these different groups that might be
Right.
interested, and a lot of these meetings were of that for that purpose.
Right.
Just discovering what's out there, who's doing what how do we get better at preserving these records.
Right.
And that was the goal of both the Senate Historical Office and my office, to see all that come together, and that meant the creation of some new organizations.
Well, we're at the birthplace of one of those organizations, the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress. You tell me, the not necessarily inaugural meeting, but the founding meeting 20 years ago, give or take, here on campus. What was the impetus for creating a new organization instead of, say, working out of CPR or CPS, as it's now known, of SAA?
Well, we obviously we see ourselves as sister organizations to
Sure.
to both the historical organizations and the Society for American Archivists, but we wanted our focus on congressional records, and we wanted to bring together a lot of the groups that were already in their own little sphere, doing some good work with some of these congressional collections, but not really talking across the aisle and to one another. So the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress was exactly what it sounded. There were centers that were studying Congress, the Dirksen Center and all the other centers that you can name, and the Richard Russell down in Georgia, and so on and so forth. This gave us an opportunity to share best practices, to discuss how best these papers could be used, levels of preservation, all the kinds of things that archivists are interested in, but also that we were trying to uplift all these boats so that we might encourage more research in Congress. And so that was the goal of the ACSC at the time. And it is an association of centers. In other words, it doesn't mean that the association itself is now some sort of a overseer. No, quite the contrary. This is a collaborative operation where all boats are equal, and we want to float them all.
Was there ever an attempt or discussion of what constituted a center?
We construed that fairly broadly because we didn't want to define it only as centers that had a certain volume of records, centers that were on major research libraries, facilities, for example. It could be almost any organization, even some that were doing oral histories, and centers that had archives. If they didn't have archives, they may have done other programs related to Congress. We wanted to cast a wide net, and the truth of the matter is it's not a very big net because, as we discussed earlier, scholars think of presidential libraries and the government thinks of presidential libraries. They don't think of what happens to these members' papers. It should be said that Congress only saves official committee records.
Mm-hmm.
And they've done that since the first Congress. It's a vast body of material that almost equals what's in the presidential libraries, and that is kept by the National Archives. And that body of records is controlled by Congress. What we're talking about with these centers is the private papers, the working papers of an office staff, of a senator or House member's workings while they're there. Those are not protected or designed to be covered by any law. A lot of members, when they leave, they just get rid of all that. Some of them put it in a warehouse someplace, and it just starts to fade away. Mm-hmm. And in a few cases, prominent leaders and so on, where the papers have been preserved, usually at a university or some other major research facility that sees the value of these. These papers are incredibly valuable because they tell the story of what members did for their constituents. Mm-hmm. And if in the United States the people are the rulers, the voice of the people is in these papers, is in these collections. And you can see how people affected what members did and how members responded to what people wanted. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is routine stuff. I lost my Social Security check. What happened? And Congressman will put somebody on that and they'll find it. And wave their finger at the Social Security Administration for losing it. So there's stuff like that. But, it gets more profound and it gets more elaborate. Almost every issue that has faced the American people, you have poignant stories of people telling what that meant to them. Soldiers in Vietnam, Michigan Action. Can you find my son? Stuff like that. And it's pretty basic and it's pretty profound in what members end up doing in the course of their constituent work. Mm-hmm. So all of that needs to be preserved as part of our documentary heritage. And that's what these groups are trying to do and what the Association of Centers is trying to do. And we're now 20 years old. We held a meeting to plan this here at the Byrd Center in 2003. We opened our doors here in 2002. In May of 2003, we invited about 35 or 40 people here, and they were a broad cross-section of political scientists, historians, archivists, and people who worked for the Library of Congress, mm-hmm. people who worked for the National Archives, professors at universities, and of course John Bradamus, the great congressman, and who also was president of New York University. John was here, and he had a good tone to the place. Frank Mackaman was here from the Dirksen Center. A number of other centers were here. And we sat around for a couple of days and just brainstormed in our auditorium. We had whiteboards up there, ideas on the whiteboards. How would we create this new organization? What would it be like? And there was great interest from all of these groups. And it was great to see a lot of these groups that oftentimes don't deal in the same circles. I mean, archivists and historians and political scientists and people that work for various agencies, all here, all with the same purpose in mind. And it was an amazing event. And what all of us discovered is this is a good thing that needs to happen. And so that was the origins of the thing. And then our first meeting was in 2004. And we've had annual meetings ever since in different places.
What do you think the organization has accomplished in those 2 decades?
I think the ACSC has raised the profile of interest in congressional research, congressional papers. I think we've helped one another with various issues of processing these collections, what kind of collections they should be, how they're utilized. We're nowhere like a presidential library, but collectively we are a body of congressional research that basically stretches back to the 1950s and 60s when some of these people were first into Congress, up to the present time. So it's a reflection of the last, mostly the research, or the activities of Congress for the last 60, 70 years. We have some collections that, of course, that go way back, but most of those are small collections of letters.
Right.
They're not significant bodies of material where you can really see longitudinally how Congress works.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, Richard Russell's collection is our cornerstone collection, but the oldest collection we have in our holdings is Senator Alexander Clay from late 1880s, 1890s. But again, that's some of the collected writings, collected letters from his great grandson. So said, I didn't want Chuck just which is fun because Chuck Clay, who's the former state senator, just dropped off his papers at the Russell Library, and they'll be joining the papers of his great grandfather Alexander Clay, which is it's always nice to see the continuity there, as so often happens in politics.
The other thing that happens with these centers is they often become then magnets. And this is what we've done. In other words, we have Senator Byrd's papers, and we have that as our anchor. It's our largest single collection. But once we create a congressional archive here, then we also have other collections. We have a long-time Congressman Harley Staggers Sr. and Harley Staggers Jr.'s papers. We have Alan Mollahan, who was on the House side, and of course worked closely with Senator Byrd because they're both from West Virginia, and he's on the House Appropriations, Byrd's on the Senate Appropriations. And so these collections sort of all fit together. And Harley Staggers Sr. was chairman of Commerce Committee and was involved with all kinds of stuff with the space program and with other kinds of things that were going on, railroads in America, all kinds of important big issues. And we see those in his papers, in those cases, those papers were just in the family barn in Kaiser, West Virginia. And I went over there with a big U-Haul truck with the family's permission, and got those papers and brought them in here. And it's funny we're having this conversation on this particular day that you're doing this tape. I'm going back to Harley Staggers' son's law office, where he has 2 steamer trunks full of documents that we're going to add to the collection, mostly photographs and other things, but it's going to be important. So if you build it, they will come.
Well, have you found any resistance? And I ask this because I know of at least one case of this, maybe more, of folks, office holders, former office holders, who may be reluctant to place their papers in a large a center that has multiple collections because they worry that, well, theirs is just this little collection, and they'll be outshone by Senator Byrd or Senator Russell or anything like that.
They all dovetail together. They all tell a more complicated story, and that's the beauty of all these collections. And you get these different angles. It's like looking at a gemstone. One thing shines over here, this one shines over here when you turn it that direction. And that gets at the complexity of Congress as an institution. I mean, you've got 435 independent operators on the House side with their own offices, their own staff, and they actually are autonomous in that capacity. Then they become parts of a committee structure. And in that role, they play a more of a secondary role, unless they're the chairman, and then they have all the power.
Yeah.
But same thing on the Senate side, just on a smaller scale, 100 senators and all these committees. So if you have a different angle on some piece of legislation, for example, some major piece of legislation, that adds a dimension to it that you wouldn't have if you're just going narrowly through, only a leader's papers.
Right.
And of course, the leaders, all of these collections, if they've been there a long time, the collections become more valuable simply because they're more complex and they cover a large period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who serves their one term, they're just getting their feet wet and maybe they're out of there. But that doesn't mean that even that collection shouldn't be preserved.
Right.
Because you never know what was that member involved with when he was there, or he or she was there.
Right.
And but I think most of it, it's leadership and senior people, because that's when you begin to see history unfolds.
Sure.
Because they're there for a longer tenure.
Do you think we'll ever reach parity with the presidential libraries and the way that scholars and the general public view presidents and the executive branch vis-a-vis the legislative branch and Congress?
I don't think that Congress will ever get that parity because it's so complex. Doesn't mean we should stop trying, but the president focuses the government on one person, and that's easier for biographers. It's easier for journalists. They run to the White House. They may start out as journalists on Capitol Hill, but when they get their promotion, it's to go down to the White House.
Right.
And
that should tell you all you need to know.
and I never liked that idea. And of course, there's been some great reporters of the Hill, and even if they didn't end up going to the White House, I don't think very many of them come from the White House back to the Hill. It's a different animal. But there are three co-equal branches of government, and we can't forget that if we're going to be serious scholars of the institution of government. History is always done with fragments. We never have the whole picture.
Right.
So we do the best we can with what we have.
That's right.
And we keep encouraging saving of these collections. Congress has never appropriated very much money for any of this. They did pass a resolution probably 10 years ago now that said members should keep their papers because they're valuable after they leave. They should keep their personal office papers and see that they're properly preserved. Oh, okay, but then they never put any money behind that. In a few cases they have, and of course there's some, the Library of Congress stayed away from collecting congressional papers because they're too voluminous and too complex, and of course then you start having to play favorites. Are you going to take this one, not that one, this one,
Right.
not that one? So they stayed away from it altogether, but they have a number of collections.
I was going to say, I did a lot of work in Bob Taft's papers on my history of the Georgia Republican
Yes.
Party. If you wanted to find records of the Republican Party in the South, you had to go to the presidential campaigns.
That's right. and of course the Library of Congress has the papers of the first 23 presidents of the United States. And of course the presidency was not a vast institution like it is today.
Right.
The presidential papers that go to the National Archives today are incredibly voluminous, even though more and more of it is digital. They're still mountains of paper.
Right.
And I think it's always going to be that way, no matter how much we digitize.
Well, we talk about the paper. That's the progenitor of the modern archival system is how much paper the nation state can create.
Right.
And complex organizations, not just government. Well, you mentioned that this will be very soon the end of your second term as director of the Byrd Center. What have you got planned for second retirement?
I have on several occasions over the years started a memoir, and I don't know if I'll ever finish it. I've got lots of fragments of it, and I did keep a journal when I was house historian. It's more than 1 million words.
Oh, wow.
I started it. I was too busy to keep a journal. I didn't have my bearings the first couple of years. I was just running around doing everything, and also wide-eyed and just loving seeing government like that. But then I settled into a routine of journal writing. Not just little snippets. It's not like a little diary or Dear Diary things. Dear Diary, I met the president today. Nothing. These are lengthy discourses. Usually, I wrote late at night just to unwind and to deal with all the issues. And of course, it deals with my dealings with the speakers that I served under, the issues that I was dealing with, what was going on in Congress at the time, the political situation. I mean, I wrote whatever I felt like writing in this journal. It wasn't designed to be systematic. It was designed to be reflective.
Right.
But it went on for 10 years. Pepys' Diary, which is one of the most famous things in the world. It's only 7 years.
Well, there you go.
So I got that old diarist beat. Not that it's going to be the same quality, or that we care much about the 20th, the 21st century, like we care about when Pepys was writing. But I've got that body of material. I do want to write a memoir, not only of those years, just a life experience kind of thing. And so I dabble at that. My personal hobby is photography, has been since I was a kid. I had my first darkroom when I was 11. I will spend more time with creative photography, but also writing. And I don't know if I have any more books in me other than maybe a memoir. And I'm 82 years old and still in fairly good health, I think. But 82 is the number. So whatever my plans are, I better hurry up.
Well, this has been a great, wide-ranging conversation. Anything else you'd like to report for posterity?
I never mentioned, in the course of all this, I never mentioned my wife of 62 years, and who, when we got married in 1961, and when I was still working in a factory and hadn't been to school yet, and she was working for an insurance company. And when we moved to Maryland, she eventually got a job at the University of Maryland and moved up the ladder. Her last job was she was working for a university college, a division which is now called the University of Maryland Global Campus. But she was alumni director there, but held a number of positions. And after I was fired from the house job, of course, it was my wife Phyllis who sustained the household. She was the breadwinner, while I tried to rediscover what my next career would be. But along the way, we did other things that I didn't mention, and that one of them was that my wife and I and another couple created an audiovisual company that sold, again, my photography hobby. We copied historical images from the Library of Congress, Smithsonian, other institutions, and created a big slide collection that we sold. It was a very successful business called Instructional Resources Corporation. I was doing that in the 70s.
Oh, wow. And
then because a lot of this material came from the Library of Congress, when I got the job as house historian, I brought this before the ethics committee, and I said, I got this company. I'm the president of the company, and I'm perfectly willing to give that up And they said, you can't be an officer, but you could still hold stock. And I said, no. So I went one step further than the ethics committee and just sold the business to my partner, because I didn't want any kind of conflict where that business. So my wife Phyllis and I ran that business along with another couple who was a former lobbyist for the California Department of Education. So, but he had this idea. He had the money, and I had the ideas of how to do this. So it was a nice adventure. But that ended when I went to the house, and then when the rug was pulled out from under me in '95, I spent 7 years as a consultant, and some of those consultantships paid okay, but thanks to my dear wife, who was steadily employed, I had the luxury of dabbling around in different things for 7 years. Until both the National Constitution Center and the Bird Center came along. So,
Behind every great man.
Well, it's more than that. It's a total partnership of love and professional development on both of our parts, and that needs to be a very important part of the record.
That's great. Well, I think that is the perfect place to wrap it up. Ray, thank you so much. On behalf of the Russell Library, I send greetings from Cheryl Vogt, our longtime director and your friend. Thank you so much for taking the time and hosting me here in the Bird Center here in Shepherd University.
We're delighted to have you here, and come back anytime.
Absolutely.